Have you ever read something so brutally honest, so unapologetically blunt, that it made you pause? Not because you disagreed, but because, deep down, part of you wondered if it might be true. Arthur Schopenhauer is that kind of philosopher. You won't find him sugarcoating ideas, you won't see him bowing to public opinion. Instead, you'll find raw, disturbing, and often uncomfortable truths that society has spent centuries trying to ignore. And among his most controversial, most shocking ideas was this: that women, by their very nature, are manipulative, shallow, and fundamentally incapable of intellectual depth. Now, before you click away or light the comment section on fire, listen carefully. This isn't a video about hate. It's not about taking sides. It's about exploring a philosophical position, one that challenges modern sensibilities but reflects the thinking of one of history's most brutally honest minds. Because if we want to understand the full landscape of human psychology and social dynamics, we can't just study the thinkers we agree with. We have to confront those who make us uncomfortable. And that's where Schopenhauer lives, in the uncomfortable. Born in 1788, Arthur Schopenhauer was raised in a world on the brink of change. The Enlightenment had just begun to crack the walls of traditional religion. Reason was becoming more powerful than faith. But Schopenhauer didn't fall in love with optimism like many of his contemporaries. He saw something darker. He believed that human beings aren't rational at all. They are driven by something far deeper, far more primal: the will. To Schopenhauer, the will wasn't just desire, it wasn't ambition. It was a blind, restless force that drove everything, from the smallest animal to the most sophisticated human. It was irrational, chaotic, and impossible to escape. And that same force, he argued, shaped the behavior of men and women, but in fundamentally different ways. In his infamous essay titled On Women, Schopenhauer pulled no punches. He described women as the embodiment of the species' survival instinct, not as spiritual equals, not as moral companions, but as cunning tools of nature. He claimed that women don't love men the way men love women. Where men romanticize, idealize, and even sacrifice, women, he believed, calculate, manipulate, and prioritize security above all else. To quote him directly, "Women are by nature meant to obey. They are not made for great achievements of the mind. Their thinking is practical, not philosophical." Now, you don't have to agree with that. In fact, many philosophers since Schopenhauer have argued fiercely against him. But the point here isn't to prove him right or wrong. It's to understand what he saw and why he believed it. Schopenhauer viewed human relationships as masks for deeper biological drives. He didn't believe in romantic love as a pure ideal. To him, love was a trick, a mechanism used by the will to reproduce itself through us. And in this system, women were the agents of that deception. He argued that they are masters of appearing virtuous, soft, and nurturing, while secretly acting in the service of reproduction and survival, not truth or reason. It was this perceived difference in motivation that made him conclude that women could never be philosophers, never be artists in the purest sense, and never be capable of seeing the world without bias. To Schopenhauer, truth was brutal, and most people, especially women, he claimed, simply weren't built to face it. Now pause for a moment. Ask yourself, is this philosophy or is it bitterness? Is it timeless psychological insight, or is it just misogyny wrapped in intellectual language? That's one of the central tensions we'll explore in this series. Because whether you agree with Schopenhauer or not, one thing is clear. He wasn't trying to be liked. He wasn't chasing followers. He wasn't trying to sell books or win debates. He was trying to strip the illusions off reality, even if it meant making himself a social outcast. And that's what makes him dangerous. That's what makes him worth studying. Because unlike the smooth-talking self-help gurus of today, Schopenhauer didn't care about your feelings. He cared about the truth, especially when it hurt. If Schopenhauer had a superpower, it wasn't hope. It was demolition. He didn't build comforting worldviews or offer warm spiritual paths. He took a sledgehammer to everything people thought was meaningful, especially love, beauty, and happiness. In his eyes, the things we cherish most are not only illusions, they're traps. And the greatest of all these traps, romantic love. Most people think love is the highest human emotion, a celebration of connection, loyalty, even transcendence. But to Schopenhauer, that belief is not only false, it's dangerous. Why? Because love isn't a choice. It isn't even about two individuals. It's about something far more primitive. It's about the will. In Schopenhauer's metaphysics, the will is the real engine behind human behavior. It's blind, irrational, and absolutely relentless. It doesn't care about your goals, your morals, or your happiness. It only wants one thing: to survive, to reproduce, to continue itself. And love, that feeling of butterflies in the stomach, the obsession with a person's smile, the desire to sacrifice for them, that, he said, is not divine. That is the will disguising itself as romance, so it can hijack your mind and force you to reproduce. Let that sink in. Schopenhauer argued that the entire experience of love, courtship, infatuation, jealousy, heartbreak, is just a biological manipulation. And who, in his view, benefits most from this manipulation? Women. Not because they're villains in a comic book sense, but because they are the embodiment of nature's agenda. Women, he said, are selected by nature to be vessels for the will. Their beauty is bait, their charm is camouflage. And their emotional intelligence isn't a tool for empathy, it's a weapon for control. He wrote, "What is called love is really a matter of sexual instinct. It is merely the will of the species acting through individuals. The object of love is not the individual, but reproduction." According to this view, when a man falls in love, he thinks he's making a rational, personal choice. But in reality, his biology has been hijacked. He is being used, tricked, into preserving the species, even at the cost of his own well-being. That's why Schopenhauer described love as a kind of madness. It overrides logic, disrupts goals, ruins friendships, and leads to obsession, and it's all by design. Now, this is where it gets darker. Schopenhauer claimed that women, consciously or not, know exactly how to exploit this system. He believed they are born with an intuitive ability to evoke desire, manipulate perception, and steer male behavior toward their own ends. Think about it. Why does a man risk his reputation for an affair? Why does he throw away wealth, friendships, and even mental health for a woman who doesn't love him back? Why does heartbreak devastate the strongest, most rational men? To Schopenhauer, the answer is simple. Because the will is stronger than reason. Because nature doesn't care about your peace, it cares about your genes. He even went so far as to say that once a man is caught in the spell of a woman, he becomes a slave to her whims. Not because she is evil in a moral sense, but because she is the perfect agent of the will. Her power is not personal, it's existential. Now let's be clear, this isn't an argument that women are plotting behind closed doors. Schopenhauer didn't believe women were consciously evil, but he did believe they were naturally, biologically engineered to control men, not out of malice, but as part of a greater survival mechanism. And men, in his eyes, are hopelessly vulnerable to it. The tragedy, he said, is that once the spell is broken, once the biological need has been fulfilled, what remains is rarely love. It's resentment, disillusionment, and often suffering. Schopenhauer believed that this is why so many marriages turn sour, why passion fades, and why so many men end up confused and bitter after chasing what they thought was eternal love. Because to him, it was never about love. It was always about reproduction. And once the will gets what it wants, it moves on, leaving the individual drained, emotionally hollow, and chained to the very thing that once felt like salvation. In modern terms, Schopenhauer might say, you didn't fall in love, you were biologically manipulated. Now, this idea is radical. It flies in the face of poetry, religion, and every Hollywood movie ever made. But Schopenhauer didn't care. He wasn't here to make you feel good. He was here to peel back the curtain and show you the machinery behind human behavior. You may disagree. You may even be offended. But the question is, can you unsee it once it's revealed? What if everything you believed about marriage was a lie? What if the dream of happily ever after wasn't just naive, but deliberately designed to keep you chasing an illusion? Arthur Schopenhauer believed exactly that. To him, marriage was not a sacred institution. It was not a celebration of love. It wasn't even about companionship. It was a biological strategy, perfected over generations to ensnare men, bind them to obligation, and trap them in a cycle of suffering, all in the service of the will. In his essays, Schopenhauer painted marriage as a cruel joke, one that men tell themselves again and again, hoping it will bring fulfillment, only to wake up and realize they've handed over their freedom for nothing. So let's break this down. At its core, Schopenhauer believed that human behavior is not guided by rationality, ethics, or ideals. It is driven by a force deeper than logic, the will to live. This will, blind and relentless, pushes every species to reproduce and sustain itself at all costs. And in this biological war, women are nature's secret weapon. He argued that women are not built for abstract reasoning, spiritual ideals, or moral truth. Instead, they are built for one thing: reproduction. Their minds, personalities, and instincts are optimized for the continuation of the species, not the happiness of individuals. Schopenhauer wrote, "Marriage is the trap into which the will to life lures the individual for the benefit of the species." In other words, you think you're falling in love. You think you're building a life. But what you're really doing is signing a contract with nature, one that says, "I agree to sacrifice my time, money, energy, and emotional stability so that the species can continue." And guess who enforces this contract? Women. To Schopenhauer, women were not evil in a religious or moral sense, but they serve the will more effectively than men ever could. Why? Because they are the gatekeepers of reproduction. They decide who passes on their genes, and through emotional manipulation, beauty, guilt, and the allure of romance, they guide men, often unknowingly, towards slavery disguised as love. Marriage, then, becomes the final stage of the trap. Once a man is married, Schopenhauer argued, his life ceases to be his own. He is no longer guided by his dreams, his goals, or even his rational will. He is now a servant, to a wife, to children, to a structure that demands constant sacrifice with little reward. He said, "The married man is merely a man who has willingly surrendered half his rights and doubled his duties." Think about that. Most men go into marriage thinking they'll gain love, loyalty, and family. But Schopenhauer claimed they lose something far more important: autonomy. And what do they get in return? Routine, stress, obligation, a slow decay of passion, and often resentment from the very person they once adored. Why does this happen? Because once the will has succeeded, once reproduction is secured, the illusion of love disappears. Nature has gotten what it wanted. The emotional manipulation no longer serves a function, and the man is left chained to the remains of a strategy that no longer benefits him. But Schopenhauer didn't stop there. He believed that society itself reinforces this trap. Governments, religions, and cultural norms glorify marriage not because it's good for individuals, but because it stabilizes the herd. Married men are more predictable, more docile, easier to control. A single, unattached man, especially an intelligent one, is dangerous. He thinks for himself, he questions authority. He pursues truth instead of tradition. But a married man, he's too busy surviving, too distracted, too drained to rebel. In this sense, marriage is not just a personal institution, it's a tool of social engineering, and women, consciously or not, are its most effective agents. Now, none of this means that every woman is manipulative. It doesn't mean every marriage is doomed. But in Schopenhauer's world, the structure of the system is rigged against male freedom. And the tragedy? Most men don't realize it until it's too late. Because once you're locked in emotionally, legally, and biologically, it's nearly impossible to escape without loss. Loss of wealth, loss of identity, loss of freedom. So, what's the takeaway? Schopenhauer wasn't telling men to hate women. He was telling them to see clearly, to look past the illusions of romance and recognize the biological machinery at play. Marriage, in his view, is not a promise of joy. It's a contract of control. And the more blindly you enter it, the more likely you are to become what he feared most. A man ruled not by reason, but by instinct, not by truth, but by the will. What separates the ordinary from the extraordinary? What defines genius? Is it intelligence, creativity, sacrifice, or something deeper? For Arthur Schopenhauer, genius wasn't just high IQ. It wasn't talent or education. It was the rare ability to see through the illusions of the world, to confront reality without flinching, and to think beyond what society deems acceptable. Genius in his eyes was a curse, a burden, a kind of psychological exile, and he didn't believe women were capable of it. In fact, Schopenhauer claimed that women were biologically excluded from genius, not because of injustice or oppression, but because nature made them that way on purpose. Let's unpack that. In his view, the genius is someone who escapes the control of the will, the blind animalistic force that governs most human life. The average person, Schopenhauer argued, is driven by desire, for pleasure, survival, reproduction, and social status. But the genius, he resists that. He detaches, he sees clearly. Instead of serving the will, the genius observes it, like a scientist watching an experiment from outside the glass. According to Schopenhauer, this capacity to detach from instinct is rare and overwhelmingly male. He wrote, "Women are directly dependent on the species. They exist in the service of the will. They are not meant for great intellectual labor, but for propagation." In other words, nature designed women to stay inside the illusion, not escape it. Their minds, in his eyes, weren't made for objectivity, logic, or abstract thinking. They were made to serve biology. So what does that mean? It means Schopenhauer saw women not as failed men, but as successful tools of nature, optimized for reproduction, not reflection. To him, the female brain is wired not for truth, but for practical manipulation, for short-term thinking, for emotional persuasion, for securing resources and protection, not for philosophical insight, artistic transcendence, or spiritual awakening. He believed that most women lack what he called the metaphysical instinct, the internal urge to question existence itself, to wonder why we suffer, why we die, why we love. To Schopenhauer, men are plagued by those questions. Women are not. And in a world built on illusion, this gives women the psychological advantage, but at the cost of philosophical depth. Now let's pause. You may be wondering, is this science or is this resentment? Schopenhauer never married. He openly admitted to despising most social conventions. His experience with women was limited and bitter. He once said, "Women are suited to be nurses and governesses, not artists or sages." Modern neuroscience and psychology would challenge that view, of course. History has revealed brilliant women across science, art, and philosophy. But the point here isn't whether Schopenhauer was right. The point is why he believed it. And it all goes back to the will. He believed that nature didn't care about intellectual depth, it cared about survival. And to survive, the species needs reproduction, not genius. Therefore, women, being directly tied to that biological function, would be evolutionarily selected for traits that serve the will, not those that oppose it. Whereas the genius, the philosopher, the artist, he opposes the will, he challenges the instincts, he often suffers for it. So in Schopenhauer's world, genius is inherently anti-biological, a rebellion against nature itself, and women, he claimed, are too entangled in biology to ever rebel against it. This explains why Schopenhauer believed that true genius must be isolated, self-sacrificing, and decoupled from emotional need. He saw these qualities, emotional detachment, intellectual obsession, existential courage, as masculine traits, not because of gender roles, but because of metaphysical wiring. He believed women were too anchored to the immediate, too distracted by social concerns, physical appearance, and relationships, to break through into the abstract. In his view, this wasn't something society could fix. It wasn't about education, culture, or opportunity. It was nature. Cold, calculated, final. Now, is this idea outdated? Probably. Is it offensive? Absolutely. But it's also part of a larger system of thought, one that sees human life as a battlefield between illusion and truth, between instinct and intellect, between comfort and consciousness. And Schopenhauer didn't write these things to insult. He wrote them because he believed them to be true, and he believed the truth shouldn't flinch, even when it's ugly. What does it mean to be moral? Is morality about kindness, integrity, sacrifice, or is it something deeper, a conscious effort to overcome selfish instincts in pursuit of a higher ideal? For Arthur Schopenhauer, true morality required exactly that, a willingness to act against one's own self-interest, out of compassion, insight, or duty. And in his bleak, brutally honest worldview, this kind of morality was incredibly rare and almost entirely absent in women. Yes, he said it. He didn't just believe women were intellectually limited, he believed they were morally shallow, ethically incapable of true selflessness, and inherently guided by personal gain rather than principle. Why? Because, to Schopenhauer, ethics requires detachment from the will, and women, in his view, are too entangled with the will to ever rise above it. Let's go deeper. As we've discussed, Schopenhauer's entire philosophy revolves around a single, monstrous idea, that all living beings are driven by a blind, insatiable force called the will. This will doesn't care about reason, truth, or virtue. It just wants to live, survive, reproduce, and dominate. The vast majority of people, he believed, are slaves to this force. They act not out of reason, but out of desire, craving pleasure, avoiding pain, seeking validation. But every so often, a rare individual breaks free from the will and chooses compassion over instinct. This person, according to Schopenhauer, reaches the highest level of moral development, what he called true ethical awareness. This ethical awareness is not performative. It's not about virtue signaling or social rules. It's about seeing the suffering of others as your own and acting to reduce it, even at personal cost. So why did he believe women couldn't do this? Because he thought women's entire psychology was built on the opposite principle: self-preservation and species preservation, not moral transcendence. He wrote, "In the woman, the will of the species acts more immediately and more powerfully than in the man. Hence, her life is governed more by the laws of nature and less by those of reason." In plain English, women are ruled by instinct, and instinct, no matter how nicely it's packaged, is selfish. From this, Schopenhauer concluded that female morality is transactional, not driven by principle, but by personal advantage. According to him, a woman doesn't help others out of compassion. She does it for safety, for reputation, or to manipulate emotion. He believed women are more concerned with appearances than authenticity, more focused on relationships than reflection, more interested in pleasing the group than challenging it. And this, to Schopenhauer, isn't morality. It's strategy. He saw women as masters of social games, experts in flattery, guilt, emotional pressure, and passive aggression, all of which, he claimed, serve to maintain control while avoiding accountability. In his eyes, men are more likely to sacrifice, to die for a cause, to speak an unpopular truth, because they're more capable of abstract reasoning and moral idealism. Women, he argued, lack the capacity for moral heroism, not because they're cruel, but because they're biologically optimized to prioritize safety over principle. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean Schopenhauer believed all men were moral. Far from it. He believed most people, male or female, were driven by ego. But he also believed that only men had the potential to rise above that ego. And that's what makes his view truly radical, not just offensive, but metaphysically brutal. Because in his mind, women are not evil because they're malicious. They're evil because they represent pure survival instinct, disguised as love, as care, as virtue. And that's what made them dangerous. Let's take an example. Imagine a man sacrifices his career to care for a dying stranger. In Schopenhauer's world, this act, done without recognition or benefit, would be considered a moral victory. Now imagine a woman being praised for nurturing her child. To Schopenhauer, that's not morality, that's biology. He argued that people confuse natural instinct for virtue, but real morality begins where instinct ends. And since, in his view, women rarely act beyond instinct, their so-called morality is just nature wearing a mask. You might think that sounds harsh. It is. You might think it's unfair. It is. But it's also part of a consistent, if ruthless, logic in Schopenhauer's thinking. In a world ruled by the will, most behavior is selfish, even when it looks kind. And if women are the more instinct-driven gender, then they are the more deceptive gender. Not because they try to be, but because nature made them that way. And to him, nothing is more morally dangerous than deception wrapped in sweetness. What if everything you've been taught about women's moral superiority was a lie? What if the very image of the nurturing mother, the selfless wife, the moral backbone of society, was not truth, but a carefully crafted illusion? Arthur Schopenhauer believed it was, and he didn't blame women for it. He blamed society. In his eyes, modern civilization doesn't just misunderstand female nature, it rewards it. It doesn't just ignore instinct, it worships it, wrapping primal behavior in language so noble, so untouchable, that to question it is heresy. Let's be clear, Schopenhauer didn't think women were actively plotting to deceive the world. He believed they were simply following nature. But what made their influence so powerful, so enduring, was that society had institutionalized their instincts, glorifying their roles not as biological tools, but as moral ideals. Think about it. The idea that women are naturally more empathetic, that mothers are divinely nurturing, that women are less violent, more ethical, emotionally wiser. To Schopenhauer, these weren't compliments. They were cultural lies, illusions created to maintain a stable, predictable society by mythologizing the feminine role. He wrote, "The weaker sex has been made sacred not because it is virtuous, but because it is necessary." In other words, society deifies women not because they are good, but because they are essential for birth, for family, for social cohesion. And in order to protect that function, culture has built a moral myth around them, shielding them from criticism. He argued that this elevation of women into moral saints is propaganda with a purpose. Why? Because it pacifies men. It convinces them to serve, to sacrifice, to obey, without question. By idealizing women, society softens the blow of male suffering. It turns servitude into honor. It makes romantic slavery look like love. It makes legal and emotional obligation feel like virtue. But underneath the surface, Schopenhauer saw something very different. He saw a system of control, one in which men were slowly drained of their vitality, wealth, and independence, all while believing they were fulfilling some noble duty. And the genius of it, it doesn't use force. It uses guilt. Schopenhauer argued that women's social power isn't direct, it's psychological. It's built on emotional leverage, subtle manipulation, and a cultural script that always favors their version of the story. He claimed that a woman's tears will silence logic, her victimhood will override accountability, her charm will excuse contradiction. And society, trained to protect the feminine image at all costs, will always give her the benefit of the doubt. In legal systems, family courts, media narratives, and public opinion, men are judged, women are justified. Even when they lie, even when they manipulate, even when they destroy. To Schopenhauer, this wasn't injustice. It was natural selection disguised as social virtue. He believed women had mastered the art of appearing good while pursuing self-interest, not consciously but instinctively. And society, needing their reproductive role, gave them the perfect cover: reverence. So what happens to men in this system? They become actors in someone else's script. They work, sacrifice, obey, not for truth, not for freedom, but for a promise that was never real to begin with. And when they question it, when they reject the script, they are labeled bitter, toxic, dangerous, anything but right. Because truth is not welcome when the illusion must be maintained. Schopenhauer didn't see this as a conspiracy. He saw it as the natural outcome of a species driven by the will. The feminine instinct to secure protection, status, and security becomes moralized, and men, conditioned by centuries of myth, serve it willingly. Even modern feminism, in his view, would only prove his point. Why? Because as women gain more influence, society doesn't become more honest. It becomes more emotional, more reactive, more focused on identity than truth. He'd say, the more power instinct is given, the more truth must retreat. And in a society built to flatter instinct, women become untouchable, not because they are evil in a cartoonish way, but because they wear the mask of virtue so well that no one dares to look beneath it. But Schopenhauer dared. He tore the mask off. And what he saw wasn't pretty, it wasn't sacred, it wasn't evil in a religious sense. It was biological necessity, perfected into a strategy, and hidden in plain sight. So here we are, 7 chapters later. We've walked through Schopenhauer's darkest convictions, his views on love, marriage, morality, and the female role in society. And whether you agree or disagree with him, one thing is undeniable. He saw the world through a lens most people aren't brave enough to look through. Not because it was beautiful, but because it was real. Now comes the question that every deep thinker must eventually ask themselves. If I see what others cannot or refuse to, what exactly am I supposed to do with that knowledge? It's easy to get lost in resentment, easy to turn bitterness into identity, to believe that awareness is a curse and that the price of truth is isolation. And maybe that's not entirely wrong. Schopenhauer himself lived in near total alienation. He never married, he had few friends, he was ridiculed by other philosophers of his time. While thinkers like Hegel gained followers and prestige, Schopenhauer sat in obscurity, ignored, mocked, and misunderstood. But he didn't change, because he believed something deeper than comfort. He believed that truth was worth suffering for. This is what separates the deep thinker from the conformist. Most people will trade clarity for comfort. They'll accept half-truths, illusions, and pretty lies if it keeps them connected to the crowd. But Schopenhauer, he walked away from the crowd, and he stayed gone. So, what does that mean for you? If you've resonated with this series, chances are you've already felt the sting of seeing too much. You've noticed how surface level most conversations are, how resistant people are to challenge, complexity, or contradiction, how emotionally fragile modern society has become, equating discomfort with offense and truth with danger. And maybe like Schopenhauer, you've started to pull away, not out of arrogance, but out of exhaustion. You don't hate people, you just can't relate. You don't want to isolate, but you can't pretend either. And here's the hard truth, that's the price of consciousness. The deeper you think, the harder it is to belong. Because most people aren't looking for insight, they're looking for validation. They don't want to hear what's true, they want to hear what makes them feel good. And the moment you speak something that disrupts that comfort, whether about love, gender, morality, or society, they push back. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right too soon. Schopenhauer said, "To live alone is the fate of all great souls." But isolation isn't the end of the story, because once you realize the game that's being played, once you see through the illusions, you gain something most people never will: freedom. You stop chasing what everyone else chases: approval, conformity, applause. You begin to build something rare, a life rooted in clarity, a mind that questions, a spirit that resists, a voice that doesn't tremble. And with that, you begin to find your people, not in the crowd, but in the margins, not in the noise, but in the stillness. Yes, the truth is isolating, but it also filters the world. It reveals who's real and who's just repeating the script. Schopenhauer didn't give us solutions, he gave us a mirror. And what we see in it isn't always pretty, but it's ours. If you choose to keep thinking, keep questioning, keep seeing, know this: you will be misunderstood. You will be labeled cold, cynical, even evil. But the truth doesn't need to be liked, it just needs to be faced. So no, deep thinking isn't easy. And no, seeing the world clearly won't win you many friends. But it might do something better. It might give you yourself back. And in a world ruled by illusions, self-possession is the rarest kind of power. This has been Women Are Evil, Schopenhauer. A journey not into hatred, but into uncomfortable truths, through the eyes of a philosopher who didn't flinch when he saw the world for what it was. Now the question is, will you?